What's going on, YouTube? We're back. This is the first episode of Out the Box, the history of FBA. And on these episodes, what I'll be doing is going back, talking about the lineage of FBA's Foundation of Black Americans. I'll be talking about the different histories and things that happened to us on our way to where we're at now. The first couple episodes going to be about sundown towns. I'm in the process of making a documentary about this, so I figured why not start my history show on the Wealth is Gangster Network off of sundown towns. I'm still learning the StreamYard platform, so I'm gonna have to go back and forth because right now I don't know how to just keep it on the screen and pause it and do my reactions to the different parts. But for the most part, this part one, I'm gonna be taking you through this documentary talking about sundown towns, and I'll give a little commentation in between or after. So thank y'all for coming out. The Wealth is Gangster Network. We're building content. And like I say, this is a network, so it's not going to be just interviews and then we got a cooking show coming. We just dropped the first little part of To Raise Natural Living, showing behind the scenes of me raising the chickens and the gardens and all that stuff. So I want y'all to just stay tuned to big things coming. But this is the first episode of Out the Box, the history of FBAs. We'll be talking about sundown towns. So let me start it off. And before I do that, let me tell you a sundown town, because a lot of people are like, I never heard of that. Sundown towns, and there's still thousands of them to this day, but sundown towns came popular early 1900s. Well, yeah, early 1900s. When in the community, you either couldn't live in there if you were black, or if you worked there, you could work there during the day, but have to be out by night. So either you could shop there during the day, or you can work there during the day, but have to leave by night, or you just wasn't allowed there at all. So that's two examples of a sundown town. So let me get started on this. Like I say, I'm gonna have to go back and forth until I learn this. So just bear with me, build with me. Welcome to Wealth is Gangster, the network. I know a lot of people just hear about the podcast part because that's the biggest part I got going on, interviews and stuff like that, talking about finances. But like I say, this is going to be a network, so we got different channels coming. So this is the first step out on our history show that's going to be on the channel, Out the Box, the history of FBA. Now let me start.
About sundown towns with a slight focus on Cullman, Alabama. We'll also mention quite a few other sundown towns along the way, and you'll see why I wanted to talk about Cullman in particular in just a bit. Before we get into it, this episode is going to feature a lot of racism, violence, and other things of that nature, so if it upsets you, I recommend skipping today's episode. Let's begin by discussing what a sundown town is, where they come from, and before we talk about how sundown towns exist in the modern day. Let's get into it. After slavery and the Civil War ended, Black people began to move across the United States. Many remained in the South, and once Reconstruction ended, Southern states set up a system that looked a lot like slavery. The Jim Crow laws. Under these laws, that were named after a Black minstrel show character, Black people couldn't vote and wouldn't be accommodated at restaurants, parks, hotels, schools, or just about anywhere really that was used by white people. Black codes were, simply put, a legal way to put Black citizens into indentured servitude and control them. And since former Confederate soldiers could work as police officers and judges, it made it incredibly difficult for any Black citizens to fight against the system or win any kind of court case.
I had to stop there because we're still fighting this today. A lot of racist people that's inside the judicial system that's running, controlling our lives. You know, still to this day. And this is what I tell people: a lot of things that's happened back then are still going on today. They're just not out in front, but the systems that were in place, the laws that were in place, the way that the structure of how this thing was supposed to go was in place back then, and we're still living through it. So I just want to make sure y'all key in on that. Keep it going.
The ABHM, America's Black Holocaust Museum, writes how this mindset spread across the entire U.S. Most Americans have no idea how much race relations worsened between 1890 and the 1930s, and not just in the South. In fact, Black Americans were the targets of racial violence and discrimination in the North, East, and West as well. Still, there was a greater opportunity for family-supporting jobs and a better life outside the South, so millions of blacks left in one of the largest immigrations in history. This is known as the Great Migration, and it transformed America. For example, African Americans reached every county of Montana. More than 400 lived in Michigan's Upper Peninsula. City neighborhoods across the country were fairly integrated too, even if the black inhabitants were often servants or gardeners for white neighbors. Between 18
And the only thing I want to point in on this real quick before I keep going is we think the just so racist down south. No, America was built on racism. It might have been a lot brutal, a lot more brutality done in the South. But Martin Luther King even said that he experienced the most racism when he was in the Midwest, like in Chicago and places like that. So America as a whole.
1890 and the 1930s, however, all of this changed. By 1930, although its white population had increased by 75%, Michigan's Upper Peninsula was home to only 331 African Americans, and 180 of them were inmates of the Marquette State Prison. 11 Montana counties had no blacks at all. Across the country, city neighborhoods grew more and more segregated. Predominantly white communities between 1890 and 1960 actively discouraged blacks from settling there. In its most blatant form, signs would be posted at the city limits. In Alex, Arkansas in the 1930s, their sign read, "N-word, don't let the sun go down on you in Alex," while others read, "Whites only after dark." These towns would also use discriminatory housing covenants to ensure that no non-white people could purchase or rent a home. Legal documents for Chevy Chase, Maryland read that any person of Negro blood or any person of the Semitic race was forbidden to buy or lease property. I'm not at all surprised that these communities were sometimes anti-Semitic as well. Small towns would keep out black people, Jews, Catholics, Greeks, Italians, Indians, and even trade unionists and gays. Businesses that served black customers or hired black employees would be boycotted, and postcards from these towns would say things like, "A good place to live, no Negroes," proud of their racial exclusion. Violence, too, was used to keep black people out of these sundown towns. African Americans that lingered in these towns even in the day would experience harassment, threats, arrest, and beatings. According to blackpast.org, an online encyclopedia about African American and global African history, it was not uncommon for black motorists passing through these communities to be followed by police or local residents to the city limits. In extreme cases, hostility toward...
Does it sound familiar? Still to this day, we get followed, chased, over-policed. All those things that was started back then are still prevalent today. And this is a major problem. Nothing's been broke. The system is continued. Like I say, people think this because we're treated a little more better. I ain't gonna say better just because they can't be as blunt as they were back then. Doesn't mean it's still not going on now. So just make sure when you're hearing this stuff, compare it to what's still going on today.
Towards African Americans resulted in extrajudicial killing. The lynching of 2 black teenagers in Marion, Indiana in 1930, for instance, resulted in the town's 200 black residents moving away, never to return. The rise of sundown towns made it difficult and dangerous for blacks to travel long distances by car. In 1930, for instance, 44 of the 89 counties along the famed Route 66 from Chicago to Los Angeles featured no motels or restaurants and prohibited blacks from entering after dark. In response, Victor H. Green, a postal worker from Harlem, compiled the Negro Motorist Green Book, a guide to recommendations that served black travelers. The guide was published from 1936 to 1966, and at its height of popularity was used by 2 million people. An Atlantic article that discussed...
And to this day, this is still what we need to this day. We need a book that connects all our businesses, all the things that we got going on so we can support that. Like I say, it's not as blunt as it was back then, but it's still here. And we can't act like that's not true. So, I'm going to be doing more research on him in this green book. I've heard about it. I never actually seen it or went through it. But yeah, definitely I've heard about it.
This is the Roots of Route 66 also addresses this. While for many, Route 66 is seen as the road of dreams or the mother road and the essence of the American dream itself, for others, it's a nightmare. After all, Route 66 started out in Illinois, a state that had 150 sundown towns alone. Before Route 66 was even connected and enshrined, the roads that formed it linked one atrocity to the next. Their article reads, Take example, one violent night in 1906 in Springfield, Missouri, which would soon become the birthplace of Route 66. Though the road starts out in Chicago, the route was officially designated as 66 in Springfield. During a grisly lynching on Easter weekend, a vigilante white mob dragged Horace Duncan and Fred Coker to the town square, hanged them, burned their bodies while thousands watched, and then distributed their body parts among the crowd as keepsakes. In 1921, the Tulsa race riot erupted in the Greenwood district of Tulsa, Oklahoma.
Just real quick about that. Still to this day, do you know there's a black market of still body parts that our ancestors were cut off, took, and they're still, I guess, pickling them? I don't know how you preserve something, but they still have different body parts of our ancestors still floating around on the black market, to this day. This is just true. And it's crazy. It's crazy and it's sick, but it's just wild.
Oklahoma. It was one of the nation's most devastating acts of terrorism against African Americans. Greenwood was an unusually vibrant community of successful black entrepreneurs, doctors, and lawyers. Booker T. Washington called it Black Wall Street, and it was arguably the wealthiest black neighborhood in the South. But after a young black man was wrongfully accused of assaulting a white woman, an angry lynch mob broke out. Long-held jealousies over black prosperity and Greenwood's wealth ignited a riot. The white mob set the neighborhood on fire. After 16 hours, at least 300 people had died, 35 blocks of the Greenwood district had burned to the ground, and more than 10,000 black residents had been left homeless. Many sundown towns seem to have deliberately hid these chapters in their history, and according to Black Past, there are often few archival records in these towns that precisely described how they excluded blacks. Still, the evidence that we do have about these sundown towns and the way they treated people is horrifying. Keep in mind, these sundown towns weren't just all white towns, but towns that were all white on purpose, actively keeping black people out by any means necessary. The definition of a sundown town changes slightly depending on who you're speaking to. Some say it's a place where blacks were actively forced out, and that housing discrimination alone doesn't make a sundown town. Others say there isn't much of a difference, as many places where blacks couldn't buy a house were also places where they wouldn't be safe. Lowen, a sociologist and author of the book Sundown Towns, who researched their history.
Just to throw in another 2 cents, today they call them suburbs, today they got different names for them. Once again, a lot of the same things are going on, just cleaned up, tinkered a little bit, nicer names, friendlier faces, but the end result are still the same.
History extensively says that, quote, I think suburbs tended to have a little more finesse in their racism, but I'm not going to back off, end quote. And for the record, Lowen is widely considered an expert on this topic about sundown towns, so expect to see his name again quite frequently throughout this episode. And of course, as we've seen more and more in recent years, these sundown towns had pseudoscience on their side. Eugenics proved, in their minds anyway, that black people were brutes in order to justify slavery and their behavior. At times, entire counties went sundown. In Mississippi County, Arkansas, for example, a red line that was originally a road surveyor mark defined a deadline beyond which African Americans shouldn't travel to the west. And this was effectively cutting off over 2,000 square miles. Yet, as opposed to learning about this disturbing chapter in U.S. history, some students are taught a very different version of events. When Lowen began teaching as a university professor of sociology in Mississippi in 1968, his students told him that they thought Reconstruction was the period right after the Civil War when blacks took over the government of the southern states, but since they were newly freed slaves, they just screwed it up and white folks had to take control again. Lowen said that upon hearing this, his heart sank, and that was a glimpse of just how twisted America's history had become. A piece of that history is, of course, the sundown town. Although this is truly only a very, very brief history of what sundown towns are, I want to start to focus on Coleman specifically. It's believed that they are still a sundown town to this day, and so using them as an example, let's take a look at how a sundown town has changed over the years into the modern day. Coleman, Alabama was one of these sundown towns. It displayed a sign that read, N-word, don't let the sun go down on your head in this town. Some version used a different body part such as the back versus the head, but the message is essentially the same. One article written by Ben Winham in Tuscaloosa News says that though he and some former Coleman residents say they never saw such a sign growing up in northern Alabama, the internet is full of stories to the contrary. One person wrote that his wife told him about a sign saying, "Welcome to Coleman," with a subhead that read, "N-word, don't let the sun set behind your back." Another claimed there was a huge billboard right at the Coleman city limits on Highway 278 saying, "N-word, don't let the sun set on your butt in this town," that was on display as late as 1989. A picture of a Klansman and a burning cross accompanied the message, or so the anonymous poster claimed. Charles Tisdale, publisher of the Jackson Miss Advocate, wrote in a 2000 column that Coleman posted a sign for many, many years on its main street that read, "N-word, read and run. If you can't read, just run." Another writer claimed the same message was on a series of signs modeled on the old Burma Shave advertisements, posted one after the other on a road leading to Coleman. One of the internet authors even claimed that though Coleman's sundown sign was dismantled years ago, it remains in storage in the basement of a county courthouse. The widely differing accounts led me to lean towards thinking that the sundown sign in Coleman was just an urban or country myth.
In a courthouse. Probably the same courthouse, probably the same courthouse that has sent tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of black men and women to prison in the basement shows the history of the racism. Like, it's crazy, man.
Even Lowen's book, which identifies Coleman as one of the cities with a national reputation as a sundown town, its percentage of black residents in 2000 was 0.7% according to the U.S. Census, does not mention a sign. And this is what I and Ben Winham find so interesting about Coleman. It feels like no two people can agree on the town. What seems to be generally agreed upon, though, is that while sometimes, like Arab Alabama, wouldn't allow blacks to enter during the day, Coleman needed black day workers. According to Lowen, the author we mentioned earlier, that resulted in a community about 20 miles south of Coleman that was virtually all African American.
They need it. You see how that works? They don't want us around, but if they need us, and this is what we get confused about. Sometimes people give us a little change, a little job, or little position or different things, and we act like we think they love us. No, we're needed. And once you're not needed no more, you kick to the curb. Being loved and being wanted and being valued is different than just being needed. Like, let's stay on top of what's really going on.
He wrote that it existed to house the black labor pool that was excluded from living in Coleman. Maids, janitors, handymen, and blacks and whites alike called it the colony. The Coleman Tribune wrote an article about the colony in 2015 and seemed to twist the narrative about what this community actually was. In their article, they claim, "It is believed that the colony, Alabama, was originally settled after the Civil War during Reconstruction and following the emancipation or freedom of slaves. The people that came to live in the area now known as Colony had probably been freed slaves from the old settlement of Baltimore, Alabama. It is Coleman County's only African American community, and in its early days, it was considered a safe haven for African Americans in the Deep South." Nowhere in this article does it mention that black people weren't allowed to live in other places of Coleman County. Instead, this article makes the area sound welcoming when it was anything but. In fact, a former hospital administrator from Coleman said that they believe the sign stood until about 1972, as well as a graduate student from Coleman. Some stories about Coleman read as follows. "My mother told us that the drugstore where Greyhound buses used to stop in Coleman had no black facilities at all. Blacks riding on the main bus line from Nashville to Birmingham and point south would step off in Coleman to look for restrooms only to be turned back. And mothers could be heard explaining to their crying children that they would have to wait until farther down the road." If you want to read the quote in its entirety, of course, my sources will always be available. While I normally try not to include too much anecdotal evidence since this chapter of U.S. history is often hidden, anecdotal evidence is at times all we have. Despite a lot of the information we have about sundown towns being based on oral tradition, experts on the topic such as Lowen have proven themselves to be credible. He devotes almost an entire chapter to explaining his research, detailing his rationale for defining sundown towns, laying out his statistical methods, and revealing how he triangulated oral history, written sources, and census data to arrive at a confirmation. So when he reports that he's personally verified the existence of roughly 1,000 sundown towns between 1890 and 1930, you believe him. And because he pairs that finding with an analysis of the history, causes, and patterns of sundown towns that shows that they were, in many ways, as logical, as often as violent, an outgrowth of American racism as lynching, he ultimately makes a strong case that sundown towns were a significant feature of the American landscape, as is often the case when
a significant feature it was most of America and still is a lot of America today. So this is what we're going to be talking about out the box. We're going to be talking about different parts of history for the FBAs, but I wanted to start off with sundown towns because, like I said, I'm actually making a documentary about sundown towns now, and they still have thousands of them. I'm gonna go over a town here in Texas that's called Biter. Right now, today, you would think it's in the 1930s. So this is what out the box the history of FBA is gonna be about. What's up, Instagram? I just went live for the last little part of Instagram just to let them hear about it. But we're gonna be closing this first part out. But I'm gonna let them keep going.
On the subject of race, the relative lack of hard evidence ultimately becomes part of the story rather than the hindrance to it. Given all of this, the New York Times write that Coleman's KKK created a racial deterrence so strong that even to this day, a district judge at the Coleman courthouse says that Black people are very reluctant to come to court in Coleman because of their reputation. Coleman was, and to many still is, known as the racist white bigot county in Alabama, which, considering Alabama's history in particular, is saying something. One clipping from the Free Press said that in Skipperville, Alabama, 1899, a group called the Rectifying Band would send letters to Black people telling them to move on and warn landlords against employing Black people. The newspaper clipping reads, "The Negroes are said to be thoroughly frightened and preparing to move. The band is variously estimated to be from 100 to 200 strong. Their plan of procedure is a novel one. It is said that they profess to be marching under the white supremacy banner. Police statement is said to favor this new solution of the problem." Arab, Alabama is a part of Marshall and Coleman County, also certainly seems ready to forget their history. At least they don't seem to address.
Okay, so that's going to be the first part of it. Second part, we're going to talk about Arab, Alabama, and then I'll get into Texas. I don't want like I'm picking on Alabama. This is just a documentary footage of what I just want to start off as an example of what sundown towns is. So this is what we're gonna be doing. We're on Wealth is Gangster. We talk about finances a lot. We talk about wealth. We talk about mindset. We talk about knowledge of self. We talk about a lot of things. But like I say, Wealth is Gangster is not just like a podcast. This is actually a network that I'm building up with multiple different channels with different kinds of content. We got the cooking show coming. We got different things coming. As far as a network. Gangster Dish is going to be my cooking reality show. Excuse me. We got Out the Box, the history of FBAs. That's the history show. So we got reality TV coming. So don't think of Wealth is Gangster. It's just a podcast. The podcast is what's kicking us off. This is a network. So, we're going to have certain days as I get the content going, have days where this show will come out on a Tuesday or a Thursday or Friday, whatever. Right now, we're just building up content. So I appreciate y'all checking us out. This is the first episode. I'll be dropping the second one Monday, the second part of this, talking about Arab, Alabama. This first one was about Coleman, Alabama. And then I'm going to get into like towns in Texas called Biter. It's a town called Biter right now. That's a sundown town right now. Police, judges, everybody in the town that live there will tell you this, even the people that work. And we have a guy that actually was a truck driver that went through this town that experienced it like a couple months ago. So these are the things we're going to be bringing on the out the box, the history of FBA. We're going to be talking. I got some footage on some lakes that used to be Black towns. All the Black people was killed and it flooded it out and make it lakes. So right to this day, there are lake this, lake that, but it used to be a Black town. Things that we're not taught in school. We're not going to be taught this type of information in school. A lot of it's too gruesome and a lot of it just meant to be hidden, So this was the first episode of that. Let me. All right. Yeah, I just stopped on the Instagram. But yeah, this was the first episode about the box, the history of history of FBAs. I hope it went smooth. This is my first time doing this type of thing. Like I said, I started out just interviewing people. Now I'm doing presentations, and now I'm doing like reactions to different videos. and in the midst of making my own documentaries and building up more content. This is a media company, so we got all kind of different content coming. So I appreciate everybody that's tuning in to the first episode of Out the Box, the history of FBAs. Go like, subscribe to the Wealth is Gangster channel. Tell a friend to tell a friend. Share it. Get your people to go subscribe and just help me build up this network. I really need y'all help to build it up. Check out all the content that we got on there, all the videos, and I'm gonna keep it coming. And we're not gonna stop this time. We're gonna keep all the content coming, all the information coming, and we're gonna keep building on this. So I thank y'all for tuning in. Have a great day.